So welcome everyone, my name is Bianca Nicolosi. My project was evaluating the use of self-efficacy messaging to increase female barrier protection use. Still hoping to come up with a little pithy title for that sometime later. And this was basically a two-part trial pilot intervention study. So let's go ahead and get started. So for starters, why this study? So young adults ages 15 to 24 make up over half of all new STD cases annually, despite the fact that they are less than a quarter of the United States sexually active population. And young adults, especially young women, are often forego barrier protection use due to a variety of reasons, including misconceptions about sexual activity and how STDs are spread, a lack of knowledge regarding barrier protection use, and pressure from partner to forego condoms, and also other barrier protection methods. So there's currently a lack of comprehensive and tailored interventions for college-age women in health settings. This health setting is particularly important because students rarely seek out information about STDs before they are going to receive treatment. So it's important to capitalize on a setting where students are already primed to be thinking about their health in positive ways. So moving on to some goals and terms, you've already heard some of these terms, but now I will define them for you. So self-efficacy is an individual's belief in his or her ability to accomplish a specific task. For the sake of this study, what that means, barrier protection self-efficacy is an individual's belief in his or her ability to successfully use barrier protection in a sexual encounter. And barrier protection is anything that is used as a barrier in a sexual encounter. So for the sake of this study, that means male condoms, female condoms, and dental dams. Another thing you'll hear me talk about is reminder cue. Somewhat intuitively, a reminder cue is something that you keep to remind you of a message that you've learned. For the sake of this study, it was a friendship bracelet that we offered. So moving into the first part of the study was a developmental study, and this was to assess what actual BU students wanted to see in a female-centric intervention on campus. Participants were recruited through clubs on campus and participated in a 20 to 30-minute face-to-face interview with myself, and their responses were used to develop the pilot intervention materials, and a $20 Starbucks gift card was given as compensation at the time. I'll get more into the topics on this next slide. So you'll see I have my scaled options over on your left, and also the mean and standard deviation for all of these scaled items. There were also a lot of free response questions, which included things such as, what do you see as the main obstacles for women to use barrier methods consistently when they have sex? In your view, is there a need for a program to provide women with information to help them use barrier methods more regularly? Why? And so on. So you can see some of my results here. We had fairly high scores for all of the information that we wanted to include, and fairly low scores for the likelihood of participation in reminder cue use. So some conclusions that we drew from the developmental study. The suggested content was highly relevant, so things like acceptance of sexuality and how to use various types of barrier protection use, assertiveness skills, etc. And there was equal interest in both the condom information and dental dam information. And all of the participants actually stated that there was a need for a program on campus like this, and specifically a program that addressed pressure from sexual partners to forego barrier protection, stigma around buying, discussing, and using barrier protection, and how to use the various types of barrier protection. Unfortunately, interest in a reminder cue was fairly low, and likelihood of use was fairly low, so we de-emphasized that aspect of the intervention and emphasized the aspects that I just discussed. So the second part of my project was the experimental study. So this was a randomized controlled trial to test the effect of a woman-focused brief intervention for barrier use compared to the control intervention. It took place in student health services. I set up a display, and as potential participants entered or exited the building, I gave a brief study description and invited them to participate after their appointment. They were given a tablet which housed the consent document and a Qualitrix survey, and upon completion of the survey, they were given a $20 Starbucks gift card. They were randomized into either a control group or an intervention group. The control group had an 8-minute video on general college health and wellness, while the intervention group watched a female-specific safe sex information, a video that was also approximately 8 minutes. So getting into the control condition, I generated both of the videos for this study. They were still images with voiceover. I won't show you any of them today, primarily because I'm tired of listening to myself talk about barrier protection. Hopefully it's the last time. And so the control video emphasized college health in 7 major areas. And while the information was college specific, it was not tailored specifically to women or to Boston University students, and did not emphasize self-efficacy. So moving on to the experimental condition, there were 3 primary aspects to this. So one was perceptions about sexuality. So this dealt with things like addressing the myths surrounding female sexuality and acknowledging the guilt and pressure that can come along with these. Beliefs about STDs focused on chlamydia and gonorrhea and provided geographically and age-matched statistics. This is important because a lot of interventions tend to focus on HIV/AIDS, and there's a significant amount of research that shows that that's not necessarily as relevant to a college population. And for barrier protection use self-efficacy, there were 4 main subcategories: the types of barrier methods and how to use them, how to communicate with a sexual partner, how to reduce awkwardness when integrating barrier protection into sex, and safe sex resources on campus like the Center and the Condom Fairy program. So moving on to measures, we looked at several measures at baseline to make sure there were no significant differences between the two groups. And as far as outcome measures, we looked at intentions to use barrier protection, self-efficacy to use barrier protection, video enjoyment, and whether or not participants were interested in a reminder queue and or any additional information about the programs and resources on campus. So moving into self-efficacy at outcome, you can see our items here. There were 6 items total at a Cronbach's alpha of 0.84, which is basically 49, which is basically a test of the internal reliability, whether or not this actually tested what I wanted it to. A score of 0.8 and up is generally considered a good score, so yay, this did in fact test self-efficacy. I'll get more into the p-values when I discuss the specific results, but that is a test of significance. And you can see it goes from extremely easy to extremely difficult with issues such as overcoming a new sexual partner's reluctance to use a form of barrier protection or refusing to have sex if your partner refuses to use barrier protection. So moving into intentions, you can see some of the intention items here. Again, there were 7 items total, and it had a good internal reliability score. This included things like, do you intend to obtain condoms or dental dams in the next month? Do you intend to have them on you, etc. So moving into video enjoyment, this was a pre-tested scale of evaluating online video enjoyment. Again, there were 9 items total, and it had good internal reliability. You can see we tested both while watching the video and after watching the video. So we can move on. Again, p-values will come up. So now taking a look at my participants. So I don't know why my graphs came out so small on this one, but in any case, you can see some of the percentages on the left there. And then, unfortunately, my graphics are so small on this iteration, it's hard to see, but the majority of my population was white, the majority was straight, and the majority were seniors, though there was a decent number of freshmen and senior graduate participants as well. A little over half were in a sexually monogamous relationship at the time, a little under half were not, and 1 person was unsure. We had, so you can see here, we have the number of episodes of sex in the last 6 months and the percentage of times that barrier protection was used. You can see that, generally speaking, participants used barrier protection a little under 50% of the time, and notably, there were no instances of barrier protection use in episodes of sex with women. Okay, so getting into the hypotheses, so we had 2 main hypotheses for this study. So one was that the integration of this barrier protection self-efficacy messaging in a sexual health study would actually increase participant self-efficacy. And the other was that inclusion of self-efficacy messaging would impact intentions to obtain and use barrier protection. So it is worth noting that since this was a pilot study, we were not necessarily looking for significant differences between the groups so much as aiming to obtain an effect size estimate for this intervention. So that being said, what did I find? So you can see here we have the measure, we have the mean, standard deviations, the internal reliability test, test of significance, and the test of effect size. It is important to note that the way that this survey was set up, a lower mean score actually indicates a higher score for that item. So if you compare the control mean and the intervention mean, you can see the intervention group had a slightly lower mean, which means they actually had slightly higher barrier protection self-efficacy at the end of the experiment. So getting into some discussion and implications here. So unfortunately, we did not see any evidence of an effect on the intervention on intentions to use barrier protection. If we go back, you can see the effect is very, very, very small. However, there was some evidence, some support for the intervention's impact on self-efficacy and video enjoyment, although there were not significant differences between the 2 groups because all p-values were at 0.1 or higher. There was a medium effect size for both self-efficacy and video enjoyment. And future studies will need a larger sample size in order to have adequate power to successfully test the efficacy of this intervention. That being said, this intervention was unique in that it evaluated an intervention that was placed in a health setting, and generally students were very interested and very engaged in the program. So future studies will need to look into the effect that a healthcare setting can actually have on participants' interest and participation in self-efficacy, and of course, looking at actual behavior as opposed to simply intentions. So I'd like to thank a couple people. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank Dr. Tibor Palfai for all of his help and support throughout this process. I really and truly would not be here without him today. I would like to thank the lovely Kilishan administration and professors who have been so helpful in getting all of us to this point. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. And for those of you who still need to present, best of luck with your future endeavors. I can now take any questions.
What was like the most shocking result that you got?
Most shocking result, I was actually somewhat surprised at the lack of knowledge about barrier protection use. I had a decent number of people who did not know what a dental dam was. For those of you who are unfamiliar with a dental dam, it is a sheet of plastic that's used for oral sex on women. So I had a lot of people that were unfamiliar. I was not really surprised by the fact that there wasn't a lot of barrier protection use among women, but it was a really stark difference, which I thought was interesting. And just generally, there was kind of a lack of knowledge about programs on campus. Like, a lot of people were unaware of the fact that BU can do STD testing and frequently has free STD testing fairs. And a lot of people actually did not know about the Condom Ferry, which, for those of you who do not know, is a service that can discreetly deliver condoms, dental dams, and other forms of barrier protection and sex supplies discreetly to your mailbox on or off campus. Any other questions? All right, thank you all.